We have in the Gospel of Luke this evening a very unique preface that does not appear in any other of the Gospels. As I read it, you will see that it is indeed very personal. I would like to tell you a brief story before I read this text. If you remember several years ago, a rather dated movie now, You've Got Mail. It was very exciting when it first came out and we first received email, and we were welcomed to hear that sound, You've Got Mail. And in the movie that was played by Tom Hanks and by Meg Ryan, there is a wonderful scene that I will never forget. If you know briefly the story, Tom Hanks comes in with his corporation and builds a big bookstore. And Meg Ryan's character has owned a family small bookstore for a number of years, and she is put out of business. Well, they become friends. And in one of the last scenes, he says to her, "You know, it's nothing personal." And her reply to him is, "Everything is personal." With that in mind, listen here to the gospel reading from Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, for hearing the deeply personal. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Hear now the gospel lesson. Thanks be to God. If I have a thesis for this evening, which is something I'm always telling Doctor of Ministry students to have when they write, it would be that we cannot separate theory from practice. It would be that we cannot separate the personal from the community or from the greater picture of things. It would be that we cannot separate heaven and earth in the living of our lives, that we are to be present here and now. We are to write the preface of this gospel in our day and time over and over again. So beginning with the personal, I'm going to take license for good homiletics and tell you a personal story. Several weeks ago, I tripped down the stairs at the seminary, one set of many stairs. I went 3 steps, tripped, could not get my balance, tripped again, and fell all the way to the landing, turned the corner, and went all the way to the ground. I went back and counted 20 steps. Of course, I lay there stunned and trying to figure out whether I was really injured. I caused so much noise. People came out from other offices and checked on me to see that I was okay. Thankfully, I was. I was very, very fortunate. But in the immediate aftermath, I wasn't sure whether this was a minor or a major trauma I had suffered. I made my way back upstairs to my office and sat there for a while. One of the professors came in, we had a conversation. I felt a bit dizzy, a bit lightheaded. I had just read all this stuff on the brain and concussions. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do what I never do, which is I'm going to go to the urgent care and make sure I'm okay. On the way there, I was overcome with a sense of intense loneliness. Fear, I think, and anxiety. Was I okay? Was I not okay? Who would I call? Who would come and be with me? Where could I go? I was terribly lonely in that moment and afraid. I was embarrassed. I bruised my knee, but I think my ego was much more bruised than my knee. Indeed, I was very fortunate, and I pride myself on my independence. But I wonder, as I have reflected on this, it's part of this free-to-be-me attitude that's so pervasive in our culture that I like to adapt to myself. And then this great gulf of loneliness that comes over us from time to time, and aloneness. You can't have it both ways. Free to be me and not expect to have moments of great aloneness. We live along a rift of separation between, in our culture, wanting to be independent and free and be an I, to be a self, and the great deep desire for community and belonging. We want answers to the questions we have. Too much of the time, we are like a child who awakens in the middle of the night with a bad dream, who calls out for mommy and daddy, and all they want is for one parent to come and gather them up and rock them and hold them until that fear is gone, until they are comforted back into a sense of belonging and the pain is gone. Isn't that our life experience? Don't we all want that? It's the human condition. I was very delighted to read Drew Faust, the president of Harvard's remarks to the baccalaureate service there at Harvard when she said, remembering the Reformed heritage, it gave us a perspective and gives us today, from the early days of graduation until now, that good fortune is not something that we have a right to. Good fortune is not something we have a right to, but something given to us we have no claim on. How delightful that that legacy of the Reformed tradition remains, and I give credit to the president, Drew Faust, for her mentioning that as a part of their service. In fact, is that not grace? Is that not grace for each one of us? Matthew Meyer Bolton, who has written a marvelous book called Life in God, has summed up Barth in two phrases. The first one goes like this: all sin is ingratitude. The second one goes like this: live all life as a form of praise. Here in these very two phrases, very simple, very basic phrases, the bridge between my pain and your pain and my loneliness and your loneliness and the sense of a greater whole is filled. That trace of pain is met in the fullness of love. This is too much for us, I think. It's too astounding for me and for you. These opening sentences of the Gospel of Luke are compelled to be written down as first witnesses, as servants, to a very good friend for the future. That's what we do. We write down these words, we think them, we pray them, we live them again and again and again. We go back to the beginning. In the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God created. Back to that again and again, and we write it in our own lives, in our own time, in our own context. Speaking of Karl Barth, and you are all good Barthians, right? Barth, in claiming his own self, his own narrative, his own theology and call, I think came up against his father's theology and his father's thinking, his preacher, theologian father. He did not agree with his father. And so part of what compelled him in his own thinking and theology was to develop his own point of view. It was along that rift of separation within himself that he began to think about what it meant to be a theologian and to be a person of God and to write in the 20th century. Perhaps that is all of our experiences when we end up in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. As Barth would say, us without God. He would say, even when you're at the bottom of the stairs in a heap, you cannot make God what you want God to be. We must remember all the time that there is a sense of us without God so that we do not make God into what we want God to be or to become for ourselves. But along this rift of separation, this incredible loneliness and fear and anxiety of our time, comes something else, Barth says. It's very simple, you know the answer, but it will take a lifetime to understand it and beyond. The final answer is that just when we have it, us without God, there is this miraculous intervention of Jesus Christ, the saving work of Jesus Christ, who turns that around on its head, that very phrase, and it becomes God with us as we open ourselves up to God's pervasive spirit in our lives, in our falling and in our rising again. This is liturgy as life, is it not? This is how we are to live. We are remade again and again, not as people without God, but as people with God. So if you were going to tweet something from this evening, tweet this. All sin is ingratitude, followed quickly by live all life as a form of praise. And if you've got room, keep going and say, through the saving work of Jesus Christ, the living of our days is remade. It is transformed as a living work of the people of God, again and again and again. One of the Doctor of Ministry students who's graduating this year did a marvelous project at a very personal and human level. It was about grief, about deep grief and loss. And what came to writing in that chapter 2, which is the theological framework out of which the project comes for the Doctor of Ministry work, it was about incarnation, which is what Karl Barth is talking about. Emmanuel, God with us. But to put that down on paper is hard work. We can have it in our minds. We can feel it in our hearts. How do we communicate it? How do we talk about God with us in the midst of our pain and change? It was a challenge. She worked very hard and did a marvelous job, but it reminded me, again, of coming back to this question, how do you talk about God after all? How do you listen for the saving work of Jesus Christ? I think in my mind's eye of Karl Barth as a little boy or as a young man sitting at the table with his father and learned colleagues, taking it in and perhaps beginning to formulate his own mind and his own thinking as he listened to them. He began to develop his own views. He had to go into his own deep experience and reframe things for his time, for his heart, for his view and perspective. This is what we do. This is who we are. Barth so clearly said, you talk about God through the saving work of Jesus Christ. And when you talk about the saving work of Jesus Christ, our lives are remade. It will take our whole lives and more paper than we can ever write to understand and to communicate and to live this out. If I ask you to raise your hand, your right hand, how many of you have suffered pain? How many of you experienced losses, big and small? Every hand would go up, all the way to the ceiling. And if you kept your hand up and I ask you to tell me that the delights and the joys and the wonder of life that you have experienced, every hand would go up as well, and both hands would be raised up to the sky. And with your hands up, remember, it begins with the verses of Genesis. In the beginning, God created. That is the framework for the living of our lives. Not one of us is without suffering. Not one of us is without joy. In the beginning is outside the notion of time. It's outside of clocks and of calendars, of seasons, and of graduation moments. It brings together the rifts of separation we feel and experience so much of the time. I love Psalm 11. I love it a lot. Robert Alter, who translated it from the Hebrew in his own translation, calls it a very personal psalm. And it has an unusual beginning because it begins with a question that I think is the echo of our own deep unconscious. It's the question behind every pastoral visit you make or will make as newly minted graduates. It's behind many conversations you will have in airports when you tell people, I'm in ministry. It's amazing what people will tell you, what you will learn. Even when I went to the emergent care, the doctor who examined my knee and I had a fascinating conversation about faith and belief and where he was in his own personal life. It's the deep unconscious question of our time. Why are things the way they are? How are you going to answer? What will you answer? What will it be? In the psalm, when it is asked, why are things the way they are, the immediate response is, I just want to fly to a mountain like a bird. I'm an innocent, good person, and somebody is out to get me to shoot an arrow into my own good heart. What I do is for the right reasons. Why are people out to get me? I'm going to go hide out in the mountains. And in a sense, what the writer of the psalm is saying, you can do that. You go ahead. You flee to the hills like a bird. But remember this, God is not flown. God is present. God is where God said God would be. And God is here, and God is present. Remember this, is how the psalm ends. I believe all of us are Karl Barths, and if you will permit me, Carla Barths. We are living everyday theologians. This is our task. We sit around tables and listen and argue and disagree, but at the end of the day, we are called to the living faith of God with us. We are called to remember again and again, us without God becomes God with us. It is the liturgical rhythm and pattern of our lives. For those of you visiting Pittsburgh, you might want to check out the Strip District. I love to go there for fresh coffee on a Saturday morning, fresh pasta, fresh flowers, fresh bread, fresh minted Pittsburgh Steelers t-shirts. It's all there in the Strip District. Last Saturday, I was on my way to the airport for a flight to New York City, and I wanted to take the 16th Street Bridge to avoid going over all that construction of Route 8. So I know that on a Saturday morning, nobody pays any attention to the crosswalks or to the stop signs. It's just people walking back and forth and cars inching along. So I decided my mindset would be, I had plenty of time, I was going to be compassionate, kind, and patient, and whoever wanted to cross the street, I would stop and let them go by, which I did. Then there was in the right lane a big, red, bright, shiny Cadillac SUV wanting to turn right into a lot. And it was taking a little more time and there was nobody coming around, so I decided to pull around. And just as I pulled around, a person decided to cross the street. Now, I was not going to hit her, I had plenty of time, but she wasn't sure of that. And she hadn't noticed me, and she looked up and she began to scream at me, and yell at me, and tell me I was not a compassionate and kind person that I had been for the last 5 to 10 minutes. I wanted to tell her, look, I'm not who you think I am. And I wanted her to know that her anger was really not, and I understood that about me. I like to think that she was saying, I want to be seen. I'm walking across the street. Do you see me? Do you know me? It's got to go much deeper than that momentary rage that she experienced. That's the human condition writ large. It always comes back to the deeply personal. So when the biblical text begins, in the beginning, God created, it is deeply personal. It is an invitation. It is not a pronouncement. It is an invitation. There is no greater gift. There is no greater grace. It's always a new beginning for you and for me. Amen.